as a reminder, Grayscale is a sponsor of this event. And so we're going to go ahead and kick today's conversation off with a Twitter poll that we conducted prior to this meeting. And basically what we asked was which U.S. regulator should provide federal oversight of cryptocurrency. And the results were, SEC 37.6%, CFTC 22.7%, and both with the most at 39.7%. So to kick it off, I'd like to get our panelists' reaction to that poll. I'll go ahead and start with Tiffany on that. Can you was that a surprise to you?
So yes and no. So traditionally, the CFTC regulates institutional markets. So I could see why the crypto market, which has a lot of retail investors, folks would conclude that the SEC should have jurisdiction. But I think an alternative view that some folks are thinking about is whether or not there should be a new federal regulator. And without expressing views as to whether or not that should be how things work out, I think that if you think about crypto and how it differs from the traditional securities and commodities markets, you have a whole asset which whole purpose is to disintermediate. So traditionally you have regulation of the exchange, the broker that interacts with the customer. There's a clearing firm involved. And both the intermediaries as well as the asset itself differ from traditional commodities and securities. So that could be another potential way that crypto is regulated. On the other hand, because the US compared to other markets already has a lot of regulators, it's not actually ideal to have another regulator into the mix. But I think that there is some merit to recognizing that crypto is different from securities and commodities, and then therefore having a regulatory regime that's more tailored to crypto so that the benefits of the technology and of the asset class can be recognized.
And Craig, maybe you can offer your thoughts as well. And how do you, what's the industry's thinking on this, and what would be kind of the effect of maybe having the CFTC gain a little bit more authority? We know that there's been some push for that on Capitol Hill. So maybe you can talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, so I think crypto is no one unitary thing. There's cryptos that are used more like money, cryptos that are used more like commodities, currencies, and so on. And so I don't think that one regulator should necessarily have full jurisdiction over it. It really depends on what is the use case and how should we promote that innovation and also protect consumers or investors from using it. So you have Bitcoin, which is more like a digital gold on one end of the spectrum, but then you have NFTs, which are more entertainment and media. And so should the SEC be regulating that? Should the CFTC be regulating that? Should it be another federal agency? I think those are important questions that we should be thinking about.
Well, and Tim, I wanted to ask you too. So, if the CFTC was able to get some additional powers, I think it could take a while because Congress would need to act. But if they were to get some additional powers, how long do you think it would take them to get up to speed with this new authority? What do you think they would need in terms of resources?
Sure. Well, yeah. Let me first, though, go back to the original question because the smart money was, on both, right? I mean, this is not going to change. We're going to have both regulators. Neither the Congress nor the Biden administration is going to try to change this. And, after the global financial crisis, when we were putting together Dodd-Frank, we faced a somewhat similar issue with over-the-counter swaps. And that act is named after Barney Frank, who was the congressman from Massachusetts who has always had a quick wit. And people were saying, well, we should consolidate the SEC and the CFTC. And Barney said, well, you could do that, just not in this country. And his point was, yeah, it may sound very reasonable, but the politics make it impossible. And that's true here. So we're going to have two regulators. But the real issue, as we've noted here, is that even those two regulators together don't have all the authority that we need. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They think, well, gee, it's either a security or a commodity. The SEC and the CFTC just need to get together and decide, and then we'd have clarity. No, because when we declared Bitcoin a commodity during my tenure, that gave us jurisdiction over futures and swaps using Bitcoin, but it didn't give us jurisdiction plenary jurisdiction over the cash market for Bitcoin. It's a bit like, CFTC has jurisdiction over cattle futures. If you want to buy or sell a cattle future, that's going to be subject to the CFTC. If you want to go buy a cow, they're not going to help you, okay? So that's true with Bitcoin. If the CFTC gets the power to regulate that cash market of a commodity, they need the resources. I've told the chairman, be careful what you wish for, because you better get the resources to do this, because it's going to take time to hire all the people. I mean, there's a lot of really smart people in this industry, a lot of talent going into it, but, it is going to take them time to ramp up. But that is what we need. We do need some oversight of this cash market.
Well, and I want to follow that up, too. So earlier this week, SEC Chair Gary Gensler made a speech. He talked about the CFTC and the SEC needing to work together to regulate and get exchanges registered that were trading, security tokens and commodity tokens. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what that meant to you and how that type of plan might work? And then
sure. Well, I think that is the challenge, because we do have exchanges that are trading both, things that are securities and then things that aren't securities. And so I was very pleased to see Chair Gensler's speech saying, they were going to work with the CFTC. You could imagine some kind of self-regulatory organization being set up under both agencies, which would come up with standards. And you would have standards that apply to those exchanges and the currencies that they're trading, regardless of their classification. And that could help a lot, because what we don't want, is to kind of have a bifurcation of the market here and of the exchanges. I think that would not be a good path because of this fragmented legal framework we have.
Got it. And Tiffany or Craig,
Yes.
maybe either of you could weigh in with your kind of perception of that speech. And I think it was also interesting that Gensler said he thought basically no exchanges is trading something that he doesn't consider at least one of the tokens to be a security. So.
Yes, so I think it's important to view that speech in the context of a broader initiative, which was this White House executive order from a couple of weeks ago around allowing the digital asset ecosystem to flourish with responsible innovation. And we can get more into that report, but it did ask all the federal agencies to do studies on this industry and figure out how can we, on the one hand, balance promoting innovation while also protecting investors and consumers. And so you see hints of that in that speech. But one thing that really struck me was references to an older time within the cryptocurrency ecosystem. There's references to ICOs and coins being issued without functionality and to raise money. And we no longer are in those days. The digital asset ecosystem has evolved since 2017, and I think it's really important that regulation evolves with it. So I think with these studies, we'll see more of that education happening and figuring out how can we keep up with the innovation to, again, on the one hand, promote it, allow it to flourish, while also still protecting investors and consumers.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I'll just add 2 points. One, I think it's critically important. Those studies are critically important because whatever regulation is adopted for the crypto industry, it has to adopt, it has to think about both where we are today and where we're going. If we have regulation that's tailored to 2017, it's just not going to be efficient and it's not going to allow the market to flourish. And then the second point that I took away from that speech was relevant to the point I made earlier about the current regulatory regime just not really totally neatly applicable and fitting the digital asset ecosystem. It talked about how exchanges, digital asset exchanges, actually serve retail investors, which is different from how exchanges in the securities markets work, and question whether or not we need additional regulation to be able to tailor or address that difference between securities exchanges and digital asset exchanges. And that's another example of how it's not the best solution to just take the already existing security scheme and try to put it over to the digital asset scheme. Instead, we need to think about the differences and adopt sensible regulation that actually can address the risks in the digital asset ecosystem.
Well, if I may add, though, I agree it's good we're not in those ICO days anymore, but the truth is, this industry may be very technologically advanced. It's way behind in terms of standards for investor protection, to prevent illicit activity, and from a standpoint of financial stability risks. I mean, the exchanges, they're simply not subject to the standards that we have for our securities and derivatives exchanges, which ensure integrity of trading, which prevent, or at least designed to prevent, manipulation and fraud, which are designed to ensure transparency. We don't have that. You have exchanges that, are taking your order. They're not bound by any rules on how to execute that, but they could have conflicts of interest. They can have their own market-making operations. They can have their own proprietary trading operations. They can have interests in the very tokens that you are buying. And we don't have any rules on that. Now, some exchanges are better than others in terms of their standards, and that's good, but we don't have any rules. And with DeFi platforms, I mean, any of you who are involved in marketing or designing complex investment products, even products that aren't that complex, know what kind of disclosures you have to make. Craig knows what kind of disclosures he's got to make on a lot of the stuff that Grayscale offers. You've got DeFi platforms offering all kinds of things without any of that. So the real question for this industry is, how much is it going to embrace the need for regulation? And some people definitely are, which is great to see. And are we going to get that without having some major blow-up or crisis that will ultimately bring it on? Regulation will catch up eventually. It's just a question of how long and what has to happen, in order for that to happen.
Right, and to that point, it is important that regulation catches up with the innovation and it's able to evolve alongside with it. And I also think it's important that when we are coming up with new regulation, which I think probably is needed, you have this new technology that was invented a little over 10 years ago, and we're applying laws from 80 plus years ago. So with the internet, for example, new laws and regulations were developed to accommodate that industry, and I think so too should be the same for the cryptocurrency industry. And when we are making those changes, we should consider what are these new benefits we have from crypto. We've removed intermediaries, so that removes a lot of the risk that you have in traditional finance around custody and counterparty risk and things like that. So we should consider these new things when we're also evolving the laws alongside with it.
Well, I would say we have new intermediaries. We didn't remove them, really. I mean, the exchanges are intermediaries. They're just a different category of intermediaries.
Those are the centralized intermediaries within crypto, but within decentralized finance, that is a true removal of the intermediaries. I'm talking about true DeFi, not the decentralized in name only that
so I'm going to interject here and just switch gears here for a second, because I want to make sure we get to some of these other areas. But so the SEC has approved a Bitcoin futures exchange traded fund. We've seen multiple applications now for a spot Bitcoin ETF, and all we've seen so far are denials. I wanted to make sure we got to this because I know Grayscale. It's
my favorite topic.
Yeah. Let's talk about it. So one, I mean, what do you think it would take for the SEC to approve one of these? What's Grayscale's experience been like so far? How confident are you?
Before I answer that, can I take a quick poll from the audience?
Sure. Go for it.
How many of you in this room currently hold Bitcoin? How many of you in this room who do not currently hold Bitcoin would do so if there was a spot Bitcoin ETF? So that's really interesting because on the one hand, it's showing us that people are already getting exposure to Bitcoin, but they're not necessarily doing it in the same protective manner that you can do through a structured, regulated, registered ETF. So I think that's really important to take note of. And then also, if there is an ETF, you will have more access for investors to gain exposure to Bitcoin. So thank you all for participating in that. So to answer your question, Grayscale, our flagship product is Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. Launched in 2013, became public in 2015, became the first digital currency SEC reporting company in 2020. And over the years, it has really proven to be the standard for how US investors can access Bitcoin through structured, regulated investment vehicles. Today, it's the largest publicly traded Bitcoin fund in the world, has about 30 billion in AUM, representing about 3.4% of all Bitcoin outstanding. It has over 850,000 investors across all 50 states. and it's trading hundreds of millions of dollars in daily trading volume. And right now, we're looking to make it an ETF. We're looking to make it more robust, more regulated, better track its NAV to really be the optimal way for investors to gain exposure to Bitcoin. And so last October, we filed an application with the SEC seeking to convert it into an ETF. And that kicked off a 240-day review period where the SEC has been inviting in the public to submit comment letters on why they think or don't think that the US should have a spot Bitcoin ETF. And knowing this, we launched a campaign to really activate our investors and the broader Bitcoin and finance community to submit letters in. So right now, there's a website up called grayscale.com/comment that I invite you all to visit if this subject matter is of interest to you, and really explains what the issues are at hand. And since we launched that campaign, there's been over 3,000 letters that have been submitted into the SEC. This is all on their website, and you can go through them. And it's 3 real common themes that we've seen across these letters. One is that there's hundreds of thousands of investors in GBTC today. They want to be further protected by allowing the product to convert into an ETF and just be a better way to track the underlying NAV of the fund. Today, it's currently trading at a discount because it's not an ETF that can engage in arbitrage, and that's representing about $7 billion of trapped capital in the fund. The second theme we're seeing, which we touched on before, is if you want the US to remain competitive within the crypto and Web3 industry across the world, well, one way you can do that is by bringing Bitcoin further into the regulatory perimeter of the US. And one way you can do that is by approving spot Bitcoin ETFs, just making it more accessible for investors. And then the third point, which you mentioned, is we already have Bitcoin futures ETFs, so why do we not have Bitcoin spot ETFs? They're priced based on the same underlying markets. So from a regulatory perspective, they really are the same thing.
Looks like Tim had some thoughts.
No, I mean, I can appreciate Craig's frustration here. If I were him, I would be frustrated too. I think we have Bitcoin ETFs, futures ETFs, that is, because those Bitcoin futures are traded on regulated markets. Those markets are regulated by the CFTC. So I think Gensler and the SEC decided, okay, we'll approve those. But I don't think they're willing to approve a cash ETF until they have confidence in the trading in the cash market. So it comes back to these exchanges that are trading Bitcoin in the cash market, right, when you just buy it for cash, aren't subject to standards. So I think, they want to see those standards develop. Now, shortly after Gensler took office, I wrote a piece saying, well, here's what they should do. They should approve an ETF if it meets certain conditions, and basically have those conditions be the standards that we want to see these cash exchanges follow in terms of preventing fraud and manipulation, in terms of transparency, in terms of reporting, and so forth. So it's kind of a backdoor way to regulate the cash exchanges, even though he didn't have that authority. They haven't taken me up on that offer yet.
Well, so
we'll see.
To that, I would say, if they don't have confidence in the cash markets, then how do you justify approving the futures-based Bitcoin ETF, given that the Bitcoin futures market derives its pricing from those cash markets?
It wasn't done under my tenure. That's all I'll say.
I'm glad we agree on that.
And I guess one last question for Craig on this. So what is Grayscale prepared to do if you do get a denial on this application? What's the next step?
We're putting the full resources of the firm behind this Bitcoin ETF conversion for GBTC. It's our #1 priority. Michael Sonnenschein, our CEO, in a Bloomberg interview, said that all options are on the table, and that's the truth.
All right. Are you willing to elaborate what all options on the table means?
All options are on the table.
Okay. So I want to, Craig had actually mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but I wanted to bring it back to the president's executive order and get all of our panelists' thoughts on that. So I'll start with, Tiffany. Do you feel like this was a significant step? Do you feel like there were any places where the executive order maybe fell short of what you were looking for?
So I think it definitely was a significant step. I think I was hoping and pleasantly surprised that the order talked both about the risks associated with digital assets, but also talked about its benefits, and particularly inclusion in the financial markets and the potential for the U.S. being a leader in innovation. I also was pleased, but also frustrated to see the studies that are required as a result of the executive order. The studies are, in one sense, as we were talking about earlier, and before we get to a place where we have regulation that will actually work and effectively both protect investors in the crypto ecosystem as well as allow it to flourish, we need to understand where we are today. And so the studies give the regulators an opportunity to work together and to understand like where we're at. So when we have recommendations for regulations, they can be at a place that actually talks about the market today and also the future of it. Like, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of the regulations we have today focus on intermediaries. And the future of crypto, like with DeFi now and the potential for DeFi and Web3 in the future, is about disintermediation. And so we need to have regulations that have that in account and are not thinking about having a central counterparty that you impose the regulations on. With respect to what potentially fell short in the executive order, I think that there's nothing in particular. The thing that people have been noting is that there was a lack of reference to states. As folks may know, certain states have been forward-leaning and have embraced crypto and kind of are, ways and years beyond the federal government. And so there are states who are saying that they wish they would have had a place for them carved out, and then an executive order that at least recognized where they were and potentially would leverage some of the work that had already been done over the past few years. But that's really it. We'll see what the studies come out and what they say.
Any other thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think they started working on this, I think, as early as last summer. And I think at that time, one of the principal drivers was concern in the White House about what they saw happening with China's rollout of a central bank digital currency and the national security implications of that. The EO was broadened, and I think it's great that it came out. I think it's great that it takes an across-the-government view and covers the whole field of digital assets. But I think the Treasury Department, for example, is very focused on the future of the payment system and the efficiency of the payment system. Secretary Yellen is giving a speech in a few minutes about that. I think they're thinking a lot about stablecoins, how to regulate stablecoins. They're thinking about, do we need a central bank digital currency? I think some folks in the White House are still very focused on some of those national security issues and kind of role of the dollar issues. And while regulation of crypto is covered, I think that will still be left to kind of the regulatory scrum, if you will, between the CFTC and the SEC and maybe the CFPB. I don't know that we'll see the White House really step into all that. We may. But look, as I say, I think it's great that they did this because it's clearly they're paying a lot more attention to the whole industry. And, we need some movement. I think Congress is probably going to take up stablecoins first. Senator Toomey came out with a proposal just this week, and there's a lot of other ideas about that. But there are, more and more people getting interested in regulation of crypto generally, which is good.
Yeah, I think it was just a really powerful signal that crypto is here to stay and America wants to lead, which if you consider the fact that this asset class was invented, a little over 10 years ago, that's an amazing thing to have accomplished. So I think it's really important to acknowledge how far it's come and how serious America is taking it now.
Well, that's pretty much what I heard from the industry, that there was a lot of positive reaction to it. And I think the main frustration was there wasn't a lot of regulatory clarity necessarily, and some of these reports are going to take months, so that's still going to be pushed out a little bit.
I think that's good policymaking, though. You want to take time, do the studies, gather the information. I'll take that over regulation by enforcement any day.
It's interesting, though. The EO was almost a bit of a Rorschach test, and everybody saw what they wanted to see in it. But no, I think the studies are good. And again, the focus on this and trying to take an across-the-government focus and kind of thinking about innovation generally, is very good. So we'll now await the studies and see what happens next.
Well, and so I guess in the meantime, if we're not seeing regulation, where do you think some of that clarity could come from? Obviously, the SEC has been carrying out a lot of enforcement, so maybe there.
Well, yeah, I think we'll continue to see enforcement actions. Enforcement is not the best way to set standards for a new industry like this, because enforcement cases take time. They're specific to a particular situation. Whatever is the result has applicability, but it's not always clear exactly what that applicability is, and there's no public process for comment. So it's not the most efficient way to get at what we need. I'm hoping that the industry can maybe work on some voluntary measures that can develop some standards that then maybe Congress could endorse some broad principles. I mean, I wouldn't want to see Congress try to draft rules here, but what happened with the Jobs Act, which is now 10 years old, where we created the crowdfunding exception, is not a bad precedent. There were some high-level principles for crowdfunding, and then the SEC was given the job of developing regulation. So if the industry can come up with some standards that say the exchanges would follow, or that even DeFi platforms would agree to incorporate as they launch, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. I think so. 2 points. Like one, like thinking about the securities industry and the Maloney Act in 1938, right? Like that's about self-regulatory organizations and the industry coming together and regulate itself. And I know a couple years ago when the crypto industry was more in its infancy, there were efforts to come together and self-regulate. But now that we have the executive order, which is like absolutely signaling to the industry that you are going to be regulated, one. And two, we're now at a $3 trillion industry. It makes sense for these more mature companies to come together and, one, educate regulators so that the studies are actually robust and reflect what's going on in the future. And then, two, come together and impose standards that actually work for the industry. The big argument is that crypto is different than the typical security, different commodity. The industry should come together and explain, one, like how it's different, and then two, the better way to regulate. And I think we're going to see some of that during the comment period. There's a lot of rules that the SEC is proposing that would or arguably could affect the crypto and DeFi industry. And I think through that process and other engagement, we're going to start to see the industry talk to regulators and propose alternatives that are better suited for the industry.
And is there, we pretty much have time for one last question, but is there anything that the industry is keeping a particular eye on? I know the Ripple case is still making its way through the court system, so.
I mean, I think overall, regulators have a very tough job, especially with any new innovation like what crypto is. So I think the common theme here is, education, striking that right balance of promoting innovation while also protecting investors and consumers. The White House executive order is a really positive sign that that's where we're going, that really fair and balanced and thoughtful approach. Grayscale is a member and donor of various organizations in DC, like Coin Center and Blockchain Association and Atom, that are really very much behind the scenes having conversations with regulators, with policymakers, to make sure that as they're thinking about this asset class, they're fully considering all considerations and crafting good policy. And I think that's absolutely the right approach we should be striking.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Tiffany and Craig's last comments. I mean, particularly Tiffany's, that the industry is going to be regulated more than it is today. And again, the sooner the industry kind of widely embraces that and works toward that, the better. The over-the-counter swaps industry, which I was involved in early in my legal career, thought it didn't need to be regulated either. It's different, it's a new technology, it's a new form, it's big boys, we don't need all this regulation. And then, it helped blow up the the financial system. I mean, you can argue about its relative effect as a cause, but clearly it made the global financial crisis worse. And so then we came in with regulation. So regulation will happen. It's just a question of how long it takes us to get there.
Yeah, and regulation is how we allow this asset class to flourish in the US.
Absolutely, absolutely. We need it from an investor confidence standpoint and to promote innovation.